We are most pleased and very happy to have a man who has such an extensive scientific background and one who is so interested and outspoken on the subject of unidentified flying objects in Dr. James McDonald. To quote from Time magazine in their August 4th, 1967 issue, in which they had an editorial on the subject of unidentified flying objects, they say, I quote, James E. McDonald, a University of Arizona atmospheric physicist, studied the records of Project Blue Book, interviewed witnesses around the United States and in Australia. His conclusion places him farther out on the saucer's edge than any other U.S. scientist. Quoting Dr. McDonald, I think that UFOs are the #1 problem of world science. I'm afraid that the evidence points to no other acceptable hypotheses than the extraterrestrial. The amount of evidence is overwhelmingly real. Dr. McDonald, who at this time is senior physicist of the Institute of Atmospheric Physics and professor of the Department of Meteorology at the University of Arizona in Tucson. His principal research interests include atmospheric physics, particularly physics of clouds and precipitation. His educational background includes the following: a BA in chemistry from the University of Omaha, an MS in meteorology from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and a PhD degree in physics from Iowa State University. Some of his professional activities include a member of the National Science Foundation's Advisory Panel on Weather Modification and a member of the American Meteorological Society's Publication Commission. He is a very qualified man to speak on the subject of unidentified flying objects, and it is with this that we are most happy to present Dr. James McDonald, who will speak on UFOs, a case study in public misinformation.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Dix. I'm very pleased to be here and want to thank both the Record Courier for its sponsorship and the Goodyear UFO Group for its sponsorship, and particularly indebted to one of the Record Courier staff, Carol Clapp, for getting this session going. I'm going to talk to you about the UFO problem, aiming at a particular point of view that I'll try to develop. The point of view implied in that title, that it constitutes a case study in public misinformation. In my opinion, after 18 months now of essentially full-time study of the UFO problem, beginning in May of '66 of last year, continuing right on up to the present, from that study, I have come to conclude that very far from being the nonsense problem that the UFO problem has been widely cracked up to be, it is instead a matter of the utmost scientific importance. And this immediately implies a credibility gap, one of enormous dimensions, misinformation of really an unparalleled degree and nature. I know of no other situation in any period where the degree of misinformation has been quite as great as on the UFO problem. I say that with deliberation on the basis of a fairly good look at the problem. I've talked to witnesses in perhaps a couple hundred cases, something of that order. I've been at Wright-Patterson down at near Dayton several times, examined the Blue Book files, talked to the Blue Book officials up to the general staff level, scientists concerned with this. I've discussed the problem with the members of a number of the private investigatory groups and groups such as Goodyear and others here in Akron and some of the larger ones in the country, notably NICAP in Washington, D.C. I've had a look at the UFO situation in another country, Australia. I would like to have a look at it in many other countries. there appears to be little doubt that the UFO problem is on a truly global scale, and so I can qualify my statement and say that the problem is not only one, in my opinion, of enormous scientific importance, but of enormous international scientific importance. I won't go into details about the nature of how I got going on the problem. I've been a little curious about it for a long time, and about a year and a half ago decided I'd take a closer look, namely last summer vacation. I thought I'd spend several months and satisfy myself there, in fact, really wasn't anything to the problem, just puzzled enough about it that I wanted to get that particular business out of the way, if that's the way it went. But as soon as I had gotten up to Wright Patterson and examined the Blue Book files and talked with the people there who have present responsibility and past responsibility for it, talked to the chief scientific consultant, and reviewed the NICAP files in Washington, I realized that this problem had to take precedence over my own professional concerns, and I haven't done much on those fields of research that Ned mentioned. They seem a little distant to me. I've been so long away from the physics of clouds and precipitation that the snowflakes seem rather foreign to my concern. UFOs seem far more important, and perhaps the time away from my profession is some kind of a direct measure, I hope it is, of my concern. I've talked to many people in Washington, and will be down in Washington the end of this week, talking again to NASA, the National Academy, National Aeronautics and Space Council people, trying once again to suggest to them that present neglect of this problem must immediately be replaced by high-level consideration. I don't expect to rock any boats, create any more waves down there at the end of this week than I have in the previous attempts. Everybody knows it's a lot of nonsense. They just know it's a lot of nonsense. They just know there are a lot of crackpots. They just know that all these people reporting these alleged craft are seeing sun dogs and meteors and comets and the like. The asseverations that the official agency that's had responsibility for the UFO problem have made year after year have made their dent indeed. The Air Force assurances that there's nothing to it, that they have checked and found that it's a lot of nonsense and misinterpreted phenomena, that there is nothing defying explanation in terms of present-day science and technology, has been, with good reason, I should say, with good reason, accepted by all of us, by Congress, press, the scientific community, and even, as nearly as I can tell, foreign governments have been impressed by the Air Force assurances. I say those assurances are meaningless. The Air Force program, since 1952, not so much before that, but since 1952, has been marked by increasing incompetence, increasing superficiality, and a more or less studied effort to play the whole UFO problem down, and I'll attempt to make some remarks here based on my examination of the problem on the apparent history of how that ever came about. Let me interject, just so you don't lose track of the main point that I'm trying to get across to you. Let me interject there that it is my opinion that the Air Force is not trying to hoodwink us I do not believe that the Air Force knows all about UFOs. Some people do. I don't. From all my conversations and all my look at the problem, I do not yet, at present, let's say, I do not now believe, and haven't at any time I've been digging into the problem, suspected that the Air Force or the CIA knows all about UFOs and is trying to keep it from you or me. I don't think they have the slightest idea or the slightest interest in UFOs, as nearly as I can tell. I may be wrong, and there are facts that appear to conflict with that point of view, but if I had several hours, I would be able to give you my rebuttal to the majority of those facts. So I believe the Air Force has made a blunder, the dimensions of which are unprecedented. I don't believe the Air Force realizes that even now. Witness a number of the most recent pronouncements they've made. Even this summer, late summer, they have come out with the same old statements about their radar see everything in space. How could there be anything in our airspace? There was a two-part issue in the official Air Force publication, The Airman, giving all the old explanations once again that is in the July and August issues of the Air Force publication, The Airman. I've seen no indications to date that the Air Force thinks there's anything but a bunch of nonsense. And I believe they are utterly and completely wrong in that conclusion. And I believe it's because of having really quite incompetent personnel looking at the problem, who have almost no knowledge of science, yet who, through the Air Force channels at the Secretary of Air Force Office of Information in the Pentagon, put out, by a series of people not knowing what anybody else is doing, put out a series of assurances that this problem is being looked at by, quote, the best scientific talent in the Air Force and all that sort of thing, when all the time the examinations have been made by people who have almost no knowledge of, frequently no knowledge of astronomy, of meteorology, of radar propagation physics, almost no knowledge of aerodynamics and many other fields. And as a consequence, coming out again and again with patently absurd, quote, explanations that even untrained laymen frequently laugh at, and scientists hardly pay any attention to because, of course, they know it's a lot of nonsense. And this pattern has gone on. The Air Force feels it's saddled with a public relations burden. This appears to be the Air Force viewpoint, that they have this burden that they can't get rid of, keeping track of this nonsense problem. They have tried unsuccessfully to get rid of it, I know. And that is as far as the Air Force appears to have seen into this problem. That appears also to be true of the Russian Air Force, the British Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, and so on down the line. Wait until the facts are out and think about that situation again. The facts, I think, are coming out very fast, not as fast as I would like to see them, but they're coming out. Well, the problem is 20 years old. In 1947, the burst of attention to UFO problems came upon us. July 4th of 1947, there were sightings all over the United States. A NICAP member is preparing a book that will be out in about 5 or 6 months, reviewing just 1 month only, just from the end of June to about the end of July, 1947, has 800 sighting cases in that one period. I have been quite flabbergasted to go over the manuscript of that, and in order to get, as I've done in other parts of the problem, to get my own first-hand check on this, I have, in the past month, interviewed about 25 witnesses from that period. In fact, I was all day on the phone yesterday talking to people involved in one particular case in Oregon in July of 1947, and those are cases just as real as one that I was checking in midweek that occurred in Ottsville, Pennsylvania, in September 8th of this year. A fellow named George Taylor, who runs the Saab agency in Ottsville, was driving with his wife on the north side of that little town up on the Delaware River. He was out looking. This doesn't happen very often, but he was looking for a UFO because a local airport manager had mentioned that for 3 successive nights, an object that appeared to be disc-like in form was hovering over a power station on the Delaware near Holland, New Jersey. And George Taylor, with whom I spoke, and whose account I heard of from a colleague in my physics department who comes from the same town, had gone up there, and sure enough, at the time that it had been seen the previous 3 nights, 11:45 p.m., the object came over the Gilbert power station, and he got a look at the thing with binoculars. It was a disc with a dome on it. Appeared to have something in the way of either luminous ports or windows or something. At least there were individual lights all around it. Hovered over the power station for about half an hour, and having come from the Jersey side, it went northwestward up towards Bethlehem, where he mentioned a number of people have seen UFOs. Well, I juxtapose those two. One that's a few weeks old and cases that are 20 years old. And right down through those years, case after case, which when I had read about them over the years, casually, I didn't know whether to believe or not. Well, I don't believe everything I read by a very long shot, and I'd read a few UFO books, but I believe these cases if you can't go out and check them, and above all, when the Air Force assures you that they have checked them and found nothing to them, just misinterpreted natural phenomena. Well, 18 months of reviewing those Air Force evaluations, explanations, and assurances leave me really deeply distressed with what has happened, both as a citizen and as a scientist. At first, the Air Force, it's become quite clear from a lot of things, the initial response on the part of the Air Force. By the way, at that time it was really the Army Air Force. The Air Force per se didn't come into existence until January of 48. In fact, the Air Force was just about 7 days old when they officially set up the UFO project, then called Project Sign. Project Sign went into Project Grudge, and Project Grudge became the present Blue Book, and we there spanned the 20-odd years. That's a good phrase at that. The Sign investigations involved about 200 cases, and I have looked at a number of those. And I want to impress on you that, of course, I'm not. The time doesn't. It's not entirely satisfactory to tackle this kind of a problem in this kind of a mechanism, this kind of a method. I'm just stating things to you without taking the 6 hours to back up each one of these statements. I am passing on to you my reactions to investigating those. Those are very strong cases. Some of those cases in the late 40s were most impressive. Muroc Air Force Base, July 8, 1947. 3 different groups of Air Force personnel saw entirely unconventional objects. This is an Air Force unidentified case down to this day. 3 groups saw unidentified spherical formed objects maneuvering over Muroc Air Force Base. In July 4th of 1947, hundreds of persons in Portland, Oregon, including a large number of law enforcement officers, and I've interviewed personally about a half a dozen of them, saw formations of wingless objects maneuvering at high speeds over that part of Oregon. In Cincinnati, in early July of 47, 150 people at a baseball game were all looking up rather than at the diamond as an object maneuvered overhead. A couple of hundred people in Hauser Lake, Idaho, I've interviewed some of the personnel involved in that case, saw oval-shaped wingless objects maneuvering. Now, these cases back in 1947 are significant from many points of view, notably with respect to the sometimes suggested hypothesis that these are probably Russian, or more commonly, American. And you do still encounter people with a little knowledge of the problem who suggest that. It's definitely a mark of limited knowledge about the UFO problem. No one who has looked carefully at the problem gives a passing thought any longer to that possibility that they're ours or theirs. For many reasons, I've just cited one. If they were American or Russian, and they could do already in 1947 the kind of things they were then doing and are still doing in the way of performance characteristics, supersonic and apparently even hypersonic speeds, almost non-inertial turns, climbs, hovering motions, soundless hovering, and a wide variety of other inexplicable things, then technology in Russia or America at the end of World War II was a very different thing from what anybody has ever heard about, and I don't know of a single scientist or engineer knowledgeable in these areas who gives that any further thought at all. But it had to be considered in 1947 as a real possibility that there were Russian weapons, and one wonders if the Russians weren't wondering the same thing. Well, a very significant thing in the history of the problem occurred in 1953, and that is the convening of the Robertson panel. It's necessary to spend a moment or two telling you about that because the entire history of the UFO investigations, really on a global scale, because the world was watching the American Air Force investigation, was derailed by something that happened then. The Robertson panel was convened. 5 quite good scientists met for 3 or 4 days, looked at about 24 cases, and decided there was not much to it. Now, the difficulty is that the type of data that you have in the UFO problem is not the sort of thing that most scientists like to deal with. Scientists like meter readings, controlled measurement data, and things that will go into equations, if not into computers. And this is not the nature of this UFO problem right now. You are dealing with anecdotal data, frequently from untrained people, frequently from highly trained people, but there are more of the former than the latter in the world, and it appears to be pretty much randomly distributed. So the Robertson panel looked at the evidence, decided there was no reason to believe there was hostility involved in any way, could not convince themselves that the objects were extraterrestrial, despite the existence within Air Force circles at that time of more than a few officers who were strongly inclined to the extraterrestrial view already in 1952. As a result of the findings of the Robertson panel, those finding no hostility and no indication they were extraterrestrial, it was recommended by the CIA that the Air Force then get this signal out of the channels that were being clogged by so many UFO reports. And having read the Robertson panel report in detail at Wright-Patterson, I speak from somewhat unusual knowledge on that. I was given the Robertson panel report by Major Quintanilla on a mistaken notion that he was free to declassify it. He thought it came under the DOD 12-year rule, and I read it with almost boggling eyes. Next time I got up to Wright-Patterson, I asked for a Xerox copy of it, which he had prepared, and it was almost given to me. Still complete straightforwardness on his part and mine. And Colonel suggested that since there was another agency involved in this, they better check. When they asked the CIA reclassified it, and it has not yet been fully declassified. But I've discussed, even before the CIA reclassified it, I had discussed this with many scientific colleagues, and I state now to you that the CIA asked the Air Force to debunk the flying saucers. That's their phraseology, not mine. It's actually in the Robertson panel report. Debunk the flying saucers to decrease public interest in them. Now, when I read that, before I put the thing in perspective, while I was reading the document, I thought, aha, this is it. There is a cover-up. But I don't think that's a cover-up at all. On further reflection and examination, I could see, by the time I looked over the whole picture at Wright-Patterson, that 5 feet of shelving of just July 1952 UFO reports alone, if regarded as nonsense by a group of 5 scientists who had taken 2 or 3 days to look at, by then, several thousand cases summarized for them and condensed down to 25 cases. If they decided there was nothing to it, you might say, well, why should the CIA want to do anything but get that noise out of the signal? And they were concerned with the fact that so many intelligence personnel were tied up with UFO investigations. And so at that point, the problem changed quite abruptly. A regulation was drafted, which is still on the books. Its number changed about 10 or 11 months ago. For years it was known as Air Force Regulation 200-2. It's anathema to all UFO investigators because they know the dire effect it had. It imposed penalties of $10,000 fine or 10 years in prison on anyone at air base level who disclosed any information on an unidentified. The stipulation of Air Force Regulation 200-2 is the percentage of unidentifieds shall be reduced to a minimum. And you indeed see the percentage reduced to a minimum. It was about 20% back in 1952, and it's now about 2%, and there have been years when Wright-Patterson has been proud to announce it's been 6 or 7/10%. But how do that? By taking the most elaborately reported cases and calling them stars or birds or balloons with essentially no regard to scientific considerations in these cases. For example, the case that got me really up on my hind legs and speaking out was the Portage County, Ohio case of April 17th, 1966, a case that occurred not very many tens of miles from here, which was probably as thoroughly investigated by NICAP officials as any case on record. I am most struck by the contrast between the original 4-minute telephone call, which would have been the Air Force investigation, had the Record Courier, as a matter of fact, there's peculiar involvement with everyone here, the Record Courier, not pressed for investigation, and finally by a series of steps gotten Congressman Stanton to demand some further investigation. It would have been a 4-minute phone call on the part of the Air Force. It's a 125-page report put out by NICAP, the Washington private group, which the Air Force damns as a bunch of paranoid crackpots, but which in fact has done over and over, year after year, a vastly superior job to the United States Air Force on a shoestring basis, 10,000 members at $5 a year and so on. And I have said the same thing I just said to Air Force generals, Air Force scientists, so I don't hesitate to say it now. This case of April 17th of 66 is a beautiful illustration of how the percentage of unidentified shall be reduced to a minimum. You may know the case. Officers of the Portage County Sheriff's Office were investigating an abandoned car, came upon the car, and while they were checking it, an object came over some trees, illuminated them, called the desk for instructions, were told to follow it, and in following through those instructions, they ended up going out of the state of Ohio into Pennsylvania. It occupied something of the order of 80 minutes, and they went about 75 miles, times reaching 100 miles an hour. I've interviewed 3 of the police officers, by the way, and spent a great deal of time looking into this case. This one was explained in the first instance, in the second instance, and at present by Project Blue Book as Echo Satellite and Venus in the following sequence. The officers saw a satellite go overhead, transferred their attention to Venus, which was rising in the east, and followed Venus. These men wore out a pair of tires, got 2 other police officers involved in the chase. At times the object was only a few hundred feet above them, and they estimated to be 40 or 50 feet in diameter. One of the officers, Wayne Houston, a police officer in East Palestine, he heard the transmissions. I may be telling you all about what you know, but this is a very significant case. He heard the transmissions of the first car. They were coming down Route 14. He realized that, they aren't far away. He went out and parked, and sure enough, down the highway came a high-speed car, which, as it passed, had 2 officers in it. Above it was an unidentified flying object. It was a luminous object, which looked vaguely like an ice cream cone upside down, and this officer sped up and caught up with them, and there were 2 patrol cars then going down, and they passed out of Ohio into Pennsylvania, and there are many more parts of the problem. And this is Satellite, Echo, and Venus. When I heard about this and talked to the Blue Book officer at great length and wrote a long memorandum to the colonel in charge down there and got an agreement at one stage of the game that they would change it, and then found a month later that they had sent via your congressman, I think that's true of some of you, via your congressman, Stanton, assurances that a reinvestigation on the part of the Air Force had confirmed the original explanation. That's when I started speaking out, because I thought there might have been some hope in the summer of '66 when I was up at Wright-Patterson, but my hope has not been rekindled since. The Portage County case finally was explained once and for all, as it was at the start, as a confusion over satellite Echo and planet Venus. Unbelievable. You should hear the transcript of the interrogation by the Blue Book officer. You should really hear it. It's unbelievable. The United States Air Force. Well, this is why when you see these cases, when you look at examples like Red Bluff, California, where 2 California highway patrolmen were, as one of them put it to me in an interview, within easy pistol range of the object, which was about the size of an aircraft fuselage, had no wings and 6-foot lights on it, and was interfering with radio transmission, so they could not call back to the dispatchers for more cars, and all they had was 44 pistols with armor-piercing shells in them, as Officer Carson said. They had the guns out and were going to shoot. There was nothing else to do, and this is explained as Aldebaran and Capella. Twinkling and an inversion. And you look at the radio sound descent as I have, there was no inversion in the first place. You look at the star charts, and the stars weren't even in the sky. Now, if that was the only time that it happened, it would not be so surprising, distressing, but it's happened in one way or another over and over again. In August of '65, sheriff's cars all over the Midwest were citing and reporting unidentified flying objects. Out of 50 cars in the Minneapolis area, every one reported some unidentified aerial object in the night of August 2nd of '65. This, too, was explained in terms of stars. It was Betelgeuse and Rigel, and planetarian director pointed out those weren't in the sky either, and the odd explanation was the Blue Book officer said he meant Wyoming, not Oklahoma. Well, if you know any astronomy about that. And cases involving mirages and sundogs and the most implausible arguments. A private pilot in in Salt Lake City, whom I've interviewed a couple of occasions, was taking off. He saw the object. At first he thought it was an aircraft, but as he got out of the pattern and looked at it again, it flashed, and he tried to close with it. It was a disc, metallic-looking disc. 7 people back at the Utah Central Airport were looking at it with binoculars, confirmed Waldo J. Harris's description. It abruptly rose about 1,000 feet, just like that, as Harris was trying to close. He tried to close again. It shot off about 10 miles, and he saw it direct line of sight along the horizon, seen against a distant mountain, Mount Nebo. And he tried again, never got even remotely close to it because it shot off at very high speed at a high angle, a 45-degree climb, and disappeared. This was noon. It was dead straight up and down noon as he was taking off. This was explained first as Venus. Now, Venus is very hard to see in the sky. This was 12 o'clock noon, mind you. You can see Venus, as some of you must know. If you know exactly where to look, you can make out Venus in the daytime. But here was a situation where the pilot's position changed repeatedly, where people on the ground were seeing it with no difficulty. And above all, where at one stage he saw it on the horizontal with a mountain behind it. And when the Pentagon announcement got to Salt Lake, Waldo Harris stated that he feared for the safety of our nation if there are people down the Pentagon who think you can get Venus between him and Mount Nebo in the valley. Well, this is no longer the explanation. Explanations change in the Blue Book files, and this is one of the difficulties that makes it very awkward for the serious investigator, because it's hard to keep up with a changing investigation. Some of them have changed within a week or two, but this has changed since then. It is now a sundog. A sundog is a refraction phenomenon caused by tabular ice crystals. You get a pair of sundogs on each side of the sun. They have to be essentially within less than a degree at the same angular elevation as the sun. It is no strain to figure out where the sun was at noon on October 2nd, 1961. It was 40 degrees above the horizon. Again, this fellow was looking south-southeast, dead level. The object moved around and shot out at high speed. A sundog. Well, I could speak at great length about those cases, but this is the 20 years of misinformation that I'm trying to encapsulate here and there in some examples, along with my rather strong condemnations of what has happened. My condemnations come first as a scientist, because here apparently has been a problem which we've all been thrown off, the scent, we've been put off by assurances that it was being examined, and it wasn't. And it appears to be something of outstanding importance, whatever it is, and I'll turn to my thoughts on that very shortly. So, the Air Force has, I think, misled us all these years, and I do not subscribe, to say it again, to the conspiracy hypothesis. Many do. NICAP's official position is that there must be a high-level cover-up. And I understand their position. I have spent a great deal of time talking over with them the kinds of incidents, somewhat like the Portage County case, that have led them to think that there's a cover-up. Frequently, airbase level people do things that look as if it's part of a cover-up. And if you look at all these together, you get the impression, there is something going on here that they don't want the public to know about. I don't think that's the case. It's generally known in the Air Force that the policies of the Air Force doesn't believe in these. It's known by many, even if not every officer, that there is this $10,000 fine, 10-year imprisonment clause, and that deters some from making strong statements. But in general, it is just too tempting when you're in a military milieu, and I've been in it, to respond to the uncertain situation where your facility, your unit is involved, by saying nothing at all, and maybe it'll go away. And when somebody scrambles jets to follow a UFO and they don't close with it, and nothing happens, the town is not blown up, the best thing for the colonel to do is to say nothing at all to anybody. And so you get these cases one after another where odd things have happened, and it looks like a high-level conspiracy, but I have just talked to too many people in Washington and seen too much of this sort of thing in other contexts. And I have really too high a regard for many of the people that have been involved in this to believe the following. I cannot believe yet, I'm ready to change my mind on all of this with facts. I don't believe, however, that it's conceivable that any security agency people or military people could confront the possibility of something like extraterrestrial surveillance with the response, let's keep it quiet. I don't believe that's quite conceivable. I've argued this in closed sessions with colleagues. Some of my colleagues are quite ready to believe that, in terms of other things that have happened, that it is conceivable that security agencies would do this for possible technological gain of, say, the United States Air Force. I doubt that would be the nature of the response. And so I don't see any other explanation to make sense of the conspiracy hypothesis. NICAP has suggested that it's panic prevention, fear of panic. And they've said that in many ways. I cannot believe that is the motive, because if security agencies was afraid you were going to panic, and sometimes the more obvious conclusion is that the Air Force is going to panic, not the public. If they felt you were going to panic, I think they would be doing something about it to carry on some kind of a transition to public disclosures that there was something going on here that nobody understands. I think they don't understand it and don't care much about it and sincerely believe it's a lot of nonsense. And when you finally learn, as I think you all will in due time, the unbelievable, I didn't say that a year and a half ago, but I sure say it now, unbelievable volume of highly credible reports of utterly unconventional craft-like, machine-like objects that are maneuvering in the global airspace, you are going to wonder what happened to the American Air Force, and you're at the same breath you're going to wonder, how did the Russians miss that? How did the Chinese miss this? How did the RCAF miss it, and the RAAF? Well, I've been in Australia, and I've seen how the RAAF, they too talk in terms of supersonic pelicans and refractive effects of the atmosphere, and in the same unknowledgeable, incompetent way that has marked the American Air Force investigation of this since about 1952. Mind you, I'm trying to get across the fact that the CIA strictures and the Robertson panel report marked nearly a step function change in the whole problem. Before that, when you look at the case files, and I have half a dozen, some of them are a half-inch thick. Investigations back in 49 and 50, a half-inch thick. They were looking at this at that time. And when you then read Ruppelt and even Menzel and some other commentators on the problem who were around and involved in it at that time, when you read that there were officers who thought they were extraterrestrial in 49 and 50, and look at some of the other evidence, it's very understandable why there were officers who were so inclined in 1952. But since that time, it's been going downhill steadily, and the problem has been almost lost from sight. Well, where else can we lodge responsibility if the situation I'm describing is as I've painted it? If anything like this is really happening, where is it entirely Air Force responsibility? Where does science stand in all this? Where does the press stand in all this? Where does Congress? Where do we have to look for the dynamics of a situation like that? How about science? Well, I looked at this problem with, I suppose, more than average interest among the scientific community for 8 or 10 years. And I had investigated perhaps 80 cases and never found one that exactly overwhelmed me in 10 years of investigation. A few really puzzled me, but I had no notion, not the slightest notion, that those best cases were only representative of thousands that were being reported to the Air Force in other parts of the country. I had no notion of that, so I went on what I read in the newspapers. And again and again, the assurances came out, and I don't think my reaction to that is very different from most scientists. When Edward Teller, certainly a far more competent scientist than I, is asked on Meet the Press, as he was last spring in the 66 wave of sightings around Michigan and so on, what he thought about the flying saucer problem, he said, well, people have a need for miracles, and in a scientific age, what's more natural than scientific miracles, i.e. spaceships? Well, Edward Teller has been reading the papers too. Edward Teller has not investigated UFO cases, nor have practically any of the elder statesmen that have so often made similar statements. There are really only two scientists who've had any look at the problem, Donald Menzel at Harvard and Donald Allen Hynek at Northwestern. And if you have read any of Menzel's statements on the problem, or his two books, as I have in great detail, you may be just as unable as I am to understand how a professor of astronomy at a rather good school like Harvard could make so many errors in fundamental optics, astronomy, and physics, as mark his astonishing book, particularly the 1963 book. Well, most of the science paid no attention to it because they were assured that there was nothing to it, and I think that's probably understandable. Everybody's busy, and why study a problem that the Air Force says is a lot of nonsense, particularly when the Air Force says they have their best people on? Well, they didn't have their best people on. For instance, in the case of radar sightings, of which there are quite a few, and many more documented before 1952 than after. There's a peculiar decrease in the number of military radar sightings known after Air Force Regulation 200-2 came out. But I asked the outstanding Air Force radar expert, and in this case I use the often ill-used word quite deliberately. I asked Dave Atlas, Dr. Atlas of Air Force Cambridge Research Labs, if he had ever, by the Air Force, been called in on any of the many radar tracked UFO cases. He said he certainly hadn't, and he was astounded to realize I was wasting any of my time on such a nonsense problem as that. This fellow had been in the Air Force Cambridge Labs for many years, a really outstanding scientist, never once involved in any of these American cases. So the scientists, I believe, had been put off by these kind of assurances. Well, how about Congress? Congress has lots of problems too. Congress could have held an investigation. NICAP has been pressing year after year for investigations. Almost had one about 1961 or 2, and it got called off. There was an investigation a year ago spring, and it is the epitome of the phony congressional investigation. It was held only because the congressional representatives from Michigan were oppressed by their constituents after the Dexter, Michigan case of March and the Hillsdale case of March 20th and 21st of 66 to get some answers to these problems, and Gerald Ford demanded an investigation. It was held not by a science-oriented committee, but by the Mendel Rivers Committee, the House Armed Services Committee. And who did they get to tell the Congress and hence the public all about the dubious, controversial status of the UFO problem? They had Alan Hynek, the chief scientific consultant for 18 years on Project Blue Book. They had Major Quintanilla, the chief Blue Book officer, and they had Air Force Secretary Brown. And they were told that everything was in good hands and no problems, and nothing more came of that. Well, is Congress to blame for that? A little bit, because Congress ought to be, when it has the chance to ask questions, it ought to ask them a little more pointedly. But again, Congressmen can't easily go out and check these cases. When your Congressman Stanton became a little bit concerned, as I presume he was, about the Portage County case of April 66, could he go out and start doing the interviewing himself? Well, I suppose if you know how busy a congressman is, you wouldn't make too much of a claim that he should have. Nevertheless, Congress might have done more had they had any notion from any sources that there was any problem, but the scientists weren't taking it seriously because of the assurances, and that brings us around to the press. What about the press? There have been charges made that the press has defaulted on its obligations, and I think the press might again have done much more than it did. The number of instances of a follow-on investigation pressing for answers that would parallel what the Record Courier. I'm not trying to particularly call any favor here by remarking about the Record Courier, but it's a rare example, a very rare example of what should have been done again and again. When they kept pressing and getting back at some of the witnesses and pressing for Air Force investigation of that case, they got a little more done than had been done in other cases. When the Houston Tribune became concerned last January with the way of the sightings down there, they were doing what they should have done. And here and there, and once in a while, editors and press representatives have asked questions. Is the Air Force really investigating this? Isn't the Air Force being a little unreasonable about such and such investigation? But by and large, the American press has not had a synoptic view of this problem, and that comes back to the way the press really operates. Very few newspapers have the resources, papers like the Times may, but the Record Courier or the Arizona Star or the Omaha Herald does not have repertorial resources to send a man out day after day following up UFO cases. And hence, the typical half-life of about 1 to 2 days of press interest in a particular case is simply understandable in the way the press by and large goes at things. They have not gotten an overall view across to the papers and to the people of the country. So you have a situation where people in Arizona have almost no knowledge about what's going on in Ohio, and the people in Ohio would have no way of knowing about a very interesting sighting that occurred in Tucson on August 19th. And just in the hours I've been here, I've learned several by word of mouth that I'd never heard about in Tucson. When you look at press clipping service, as I have a chance to do, again through the good offices of NICAP, you are using lots of strong words, and it's dangerous in communicating with anyone to keep on using strong words. It's a problem that just brings out strong words. It is hard to believe the number of UFO reports that are getting to local papers all over the country, never getting on the wires, seldom, I should say, never, seldom getting on the wires, because again, wire editors know it's a lot of nonsense. The things that do frequently get on the wires are the cases where there's been a crackpot or cultist involvement or something really strange. That always peaks, and again, it's human interest. One understands this sort of thing. It's more fun to write about somebody who says the UFOs are bringing a salvation message from Venus. They're here to save us. And I've been on a ride on the flying saucer. I went to Mars. That sort of story is more fun to write. It's easier to write that story than to take an inexplicable phenomenon and report it and have no answer. It's just unsatisfactory from a journalistic point of view. And so all this has led to unawareness on the part of the public, misinformation or zero information. We are collectively quite uninformed through normal press channels about foreign sightings. In general, American papers carry very little domestic news of foreign countries, but when it comes to UFO sightings, why carry any? We have enough nuts in America to report. Let's not report the nuts from South America or from Australia. So I have been to Australia and looked at some of the nuts, and they are not nuts at all. They are perfectly straightforward people who do not know what they saw, but this is what they saw and so on. For instance, a very interesting one I checked 80 cases in Australia when I was down there in midsummer. An Anglican clergyman and his wife looking out the rectory window, mind you, of his pastorate, when a large cigar-shaped object came out of a rain cloud, hovered. He thought at first it was an aircraft crashing. He and his wife were watching it at sunset. Suddenly, from out of the storm, which was off in the distance, 5 small disc-like objects came and took formation around the cigar-shaped objects, went into various positions, and finally they went all at one end, and the whole works slid back into the cloud and disappeared. Well, this is explained by the RAF as a refracted and distorted image of the moon caused by scud cloud. And I went to the area in Tasmania, talked to Reverend Lionel Browning about this case, looked carefully at the topo sheets. There was a 5,000-foot mountain between Reverend Browning's place and the distant eastern horizon, and there was a complete curtain of rain surrounding about 90 degrees of azimuth. They couldn't possibly have seen the moon through all of this, and this sort of explanation is going on. Well, was that reported in the American papers? Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. So when I read about it in a UFO report, I ignored it. I don't know. Browning, I don't even know if there is a Reverend Browning. That's 8,000 miles away. Why believe a story that you read in a UFO book, you see? You don't know what to believe. Channels of information are very seriously jeopardized in cases like this. Well, I've suggested that I can't really see that the primary blame can be put on science, Congress, press. Each of them might have done differently. I'm afraid the blame lies very strongly on the official investigatory group in the American Air Force, and same with the British and all the other organizations. But I think that because we have put so much money into it over the years and had an official program like no other nation has had, that it is probably quite as Jacques Vallée, a French investigator, told me, that when they went to the French government and asked for support for an investigation, the French government responded, "Why spend good French money when the United States Air Force, with all its Markowitz, Cash, has been looking into this thing for years and shown that there's nothing to it. I think that's had its influence around the world, and indeed a baleful influence it is. Well, what could be the actual nature of the subject that I'm talking about? I'm near the end of my remarks, and it was not my main point to talk to you about so much the substance of the UFO problem as this matter of misinformation. I've been trying to drive home that viewpoint and backing it up here and there with some examples, but not trying to mainly discuss the scientific aspects. I've done that with many other scientific groups. In fact, I'm on my way east to talk at MIT and Westinghouse Labs and Air Force Cambridge Labs and Smithsonian Observatory down to Washington and so on. That's the problem in talking with those groups. What could it be? A lot of hypotheses. I've remarked on some of them already, but let me just wind up quickly by going to what I think is the heart of the matter. It's pretty hard to square the UFO facts that you find by digging into the problem with any hypothesis except the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Practically all of the others, psychological, hoax, meteorological, astronomical, just do not fit the credibly reported cases. There's just too much evidence now. And the alternative that I see to the hypothesis, but mind you, I call it an hypothesis, and not just for weasel word, not for academic pussyfooting, because what an incredible hypothesis that is. And it's not original with me. NICAP was saying it, a lot of people in this audience were saying it long before I knew very much about the UFO problem. It's an hypothesis to be compared with other alternatives and to be thrown out if something better comes along. It's well to put it that way in science until you have pretty strong evidence, because you get married to a theory and you find yourself no longer looking quite so candidly at all the facts as if you keep telling yourself hypothesis, hypothesis, hypothesis. That hypothesis, these may be probes from some extraterrestrial source, is, in my opinion, the most satisfactory one now. It is very improbable on a priori grounds. There are all kinds of them. If you read last week's Science, you saw an analysis by a scientist who obviously has very limited knowledge of the UFO problem, but who rehashed old thoughts that everybody who's looked at the problem carefully knows all about. Namely, there's no darn way to solve the propulsion problem to get them from extra solar sources here, and they aren't likely to come from within the solar system, therefore they can't exist. This is Science lead article last week. We can't explain it, they can't exist. Now, you would think that that kind of an argument in the 1960s would not be made by an experienced scientist, but it is. I run into this all the time among my colleagues and elsewhere. It's as if Charles Goodyear said, back in the 1830s when he was trying to figure out a better way to make a goulash and a raincoat, since there's no way to make rubber survive in all seasons, it can't be done, and just throw in the hat. Well, if he had to explain, suppose he had to give a full explanation in scientific terms, an adequate and correct scientific explanation for how he would vulcanize the rubber. Imagine his embarrassment at 1830. Imagine the embarrassment of some of the organic chemists if you put it to them right now. How does the sulfur cross-linking process work? We don't know in 1967, but years and years of rubber technology are behind us, and people like Ned Roberts are busy selling the products, and we're driving and flying on them all the time. That kind of argument that because we can't explain it, it doesn't exist is a sophomoric argument of the nth water. Markowitz in this same article suggested that he rebutted Alan Hynek's comments, and here is a case where I side with Alan Hynek. I'm in general a bit distressed with Alan Hynek's 18-year contribution to the problem, but when in his science article he said that he answered a frequently thrown up objection. Why haven't he contacted us? Well, of course, I don't know why they haven't, I'll skip over the pronoun, why they haven't contacted, neither does Alan Hynek or anybody else, but he made the, I think, reasonable suggestion that it's like this. If we encountered a new species of kangaroo in the backlands of Australia, would we begin by trying to communicate with it? And Markowitz's rebuttal to that is, well, that's absurd. When the kangaroos are very different from us, but when we encountered primitive human species, we always attempted to get into communication with them. Well, indeed we did. But how does Markowitz know that we are not to extraterrestrial civilization, much as the kangaroos are to us? One doesn't know, you see. You just have to remind yourself you do not know what you're dealing with in this problem. And so, the alternative hypotheses that you can turn to are exotic, bizarre hypotheses, much more bizarre than the extraterrestrial hypothesis, such things as time travel. And I've heard scientists seriously propose that these things come, from a different time. Well, this is, to my way of thinking, utter science fiction. It defies relativistic principles that are pretty solidly embedded in physics now, ultimately resting on the speed of light limit. I don't think time travel is anything more than a Wellesian fiction. I can't be sure of that. What I do feel strongly about, is that's more bizarre than extraterrestrial visitation. Then there is the possibility, and this has to be given passing thought, that there is, I've heard a good scientist say this, I guess I won't quote him because I regard it pretty nonsensical myself, that there may be, listen carefully, another civilization on this planet, that they are terrestrial, and that there is another civilization. Well, where the dickens is it? How could this strikes me as fanciful in the worst sense. One thing I've put myself a little bit in this spot by thinking about the submarine problem. I don't want to start off on that, but there are more than a few examples of unidentified objects being seen by very good observers coming out of the ocean. And you could say, whoa, that's a good place to hide. I don't think so. I don't think, maybe a good place to hide. We don't know much about the ocean, but it's a very poor place to evolve and advance technology. How would you go through the combustion and flame phase, when you're in development? And what is that? And this is just nonsense, isn't it? To think that there is, well, I think so. I think it's far more improbable than the extraterrestrial hypothesis, even though I fully agree that in 1967, with the most far-fetched ideas for propulsion, matter annihilating matter, the sort of things Markowitz did quite competently discuss, and which others have equally competently discussed before, doesn't even begin to explain how you get in a decent interval of time from 10 light years out to here. But so what? Maybe a decent interval of time has very different kinds. There are all kinds of things that can be said, but it's waste of time to speculate. Why say, as I can easily say, maybe the lifespan of beings somewhere out there is 500 years, so that a 25-year round trip is nothing at all. Well, I can say that. I don't know what I'm talking about, so I might as well not say it. What can be said is that there may well be technologies so far beyond ours, able to do things with exploitation of our present knowledge plus knowledge we haven't even begun to dream about, that things that look utterly inexplicable to us may be run-of-the-mill stuff to someone else, and such a technology may be having a look at us. Also, may not be. But if there is even a chance of that, see, if there is a chance that we're under surveillance, is there a person in this room who would suggest that, so what is the response? Who cares? I hope not. I've heard one or two people in my months of talking, heard one or two people say that, but I regard that as essentially a subhuman response to such a suggestion. You can say it's nonsense. That's a different thing for saying who cares. I think it would be not worthy of the human species to say, certainly we're curious, even if the UFO things aren't. But this problem is so much more involved than I can possibly discuss in the hour I have now taken, that I won't attempt to offer still other hypotheses, except to say that having looked at all of these as carefully as I can, I'm inclined to think that that's the most satisfactory hypothesis that I can now imagine, that the world is under surveillance of some sort. There are just too many examples. I haven't discussed car stopping cases and car pursuit cases, aircraft pacing, train pacing, like the case in the Monon Railroad, 1961, October 3rd or something, 1958, excuse me, where for 70 minutes a freight train was paced by four glowing objects. Talked to all three of the trainmen who were involved in this case. That suggests surveillance. And so does the Portage County case, and so do hundreds of others. And you say, why no contact? Well, last July 27th, three persons in Newton, New Hampshire were out looking at the stars when a small point of light suddenly became a rather large luminous source. One of the fellows had a flashlight. He blinked first 3 times and got an immediate response 3 times, and before this object had made 7 or 8 passes over them, they had varied the blink frequency, and every time got back a response from this object. They got very curious about this and watched some more, and about a month and a half later, a near repetition of this. They had better optics with them that time, and one of the gentlemen who was employed at Avco, I was on the phone with him about a week ago, he said this thing filled the whole binocular field. It was so large. It was a dome disc with a band of luminosity around the middle of it and 3 bright lights with a red light on the top. This time it only made 3 passes over them, but they again blinked and they again got response. When I was in Australia, I talked to 3 men who had been kangaroo hunting. One of them had a spotlight. They use spotlights, a very brutal way of hunting. They call it spotlighting. And one of the fellows said, "Give him some Morse." And he flicked the lights on, and they got out of there in a hurry when they got the same signals back from this object. There was a pilot named Gene Miller who was flying in California over Banning, did the same thing with landing lights. So, and there are some other examples, not huge numbers of these, but in the UFO cases there are indications of, quote, contact. Not very many, and strange in its nature frequently, more often suggesting evasion than contact. But don't ask me to rationalize that in any terms. It would be, I think, utterly fallacious in the deepest sense to suggest that my logic or my psychology must apply to some sentient being from somewhere else. Now, if you don't agree with that, if you are one who thinks we can reduce this to principles of curiosity and the like, I'd like to argue with you at length about where do you think we will be 2,000 years from now, not just in the things we drive around, but in our attitudes towards many kinds of problems. Haven't we changed our anthropological outlook on primitive races in 200 years? Look what happened to the Tasmanians in 70 years. There is not a Tasmanian left. We would not do that in 1960. We wouldn't eradicate, well, we wouldn't do it with a well, we have changed. We're improving somewhat. We are improving somewhat. The curve is rising. So it would be fallacious, I think, to make strong insistences that this and that type of human response must be expected by some surveillance system from elsewhere, and if it doesn't exhibit that, it can't be. It doesn't exist. Have a look at the UFO evidence. Look at some of the evidence amassed by groups in this state, and NICAP and APO and various others, and then compare that with what the Air Force has done, and go out and start checking these cases yourself, and you will probably be, as I now am, appalled at the 20 years of misinformation. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. McDonald, for a very informative and thought-provoking talk. Dr. McDonald is now consented to answer some questions if members of the audience would care to ask them.
Dr. McDonald, I would like to know if you have any comments that you would like to make in regard to Dr. Conlon's work at the University of Colorado project.
Yes, I've been in touch with the Colorado people right along and know a fair amount about what's going on there. I am delighted that a group within a university science body has been put onto this problem. I wish it had been by some agency other than the United States Air Force for reasons that I've spelled out very clearly to Dr. Condon, but needn't elaborate here. I'm hopeful that they will begin to sort the problem out. I would be happier if they had made more vigorous progress in many directions than they have, and I wish they had more scientific competence, total competence in terms of man hours and fields and so on than they have. I have said to Air Force people there ought to be much more money in this, and they have gotten some more money, and perhaps partly as a result of my saying that, perhaps partly for other reasons. But I think that the people who really are pushing along fastest are people down at the level of the investigating group that are out talking to the witnesses. That's what you have to do. You have no idea how salutary an influence it is to go talk to some witnesses. And unfortunately, Dr. Condon, for example, is not doing any of this, but he is, in Well, I want to be careful how I put this, lest I somehow overstep the bounds of courtesy. His interest appears to be focused on the crackpot fringe in a way that I think is an utter waste of time, because the crackpot fringe is a noise in the total signal. But sometimes you have trouble filtering noise, and then it's bad. Hoaxes and frauds are hard to sort out. But crackpots, give me 5 minutes with a crackpot, and I believe I've spotted them every time, and the same with anybody else. So to talk as Dr. Condon did about a week ago, it's the 13th of September, first major talk he's given to any scientific group at the National Bureau of Standards Spectroscopy Symposium, an international symposium, 150 to 200 good scientists there, spend the entire evening talking only about crackpots, and leaving many of those scientists with a feeling that that's all Colorado is encountering is worrisome to me, and I have recently communicated that feeling to one of the Colorado people. I'm hopeful. It's a good thing.
I'd like a two-part question answered, if you would, please, Doctor. I'd like to know your thoughts upon power failures associated with UFOs throughout the world as Part A, and Part B, do you associate UFO presence with any that you know of, mineral sources in the earth, or any other reason for them coming in the areas they do?
Well, let me briefly answer the second one, because I can get that one. I won't forget the second question then. I don't see any overwhelming indication that the UFOs are paying attention to mineral deposits. There are some cases, and one that exemplifies the point that probably stimulates your question. There have been quite a few in the uranium district of southwestern Colorado, and there are other examples of that, but you have to be very careful about jumping too quickly to those kind of conclusions. And I at present, I may be wrong, and I may change my notions on that, but I don't see enough of that to be terribly struck by that. The first question is requires a more elaborate answer, and this is the one part of the entire UFO problem. Mr. Dix has asked me about this at the dinner this evening, and I took care to answer quite carefully, and I'll try now to answer carefully. There are too many instances of UFO observations over power facilities, and a smaller number, but too many, instances of outages coincident therewith, for me to be happy about that. I think that is the one place where you might argue that there is more than just scientific curiosity reasons for getting at this problem. I hope that doesn't strike you as having pressed a panic button, because if that did, unpress the button. I just say the coincidences are a little too many to treat it casually. There are about a dozen cases of which I know where system outages occurred coincidental with UFOs. Some of these are on a very small scale. An incident where a single house, two incidents I know of, where the power in a single house went out. Now, there are ways of talking about that in terms of magnetic effects, just as there are ways of talking about, not necessarily explaining, but making a little bit of sense about the far more numerous cases of car stoppage, ignition failures, and this is a very common occurrence, relatively speaking. But even in the New York outage of November 9, 1965, there were many UFO reports, just too many to treat it casually. Some of them in Manhattan. I've interviewed witnesses involved in some of those. So when I went to the Federal Power Commission to try to get the full story on this, it'd take a little long. I don't want to elaborate this answer, but again, I was very surprised at the fact you can't get any information on outages, because the private utilities don't want to report outages to the FPC. So I want to make a probability computation. How frequently do outages occur versus how frequently are UFOs seen? What are the product probabilities here of these being fortuitous? And you can't get the FPC. You have better data on UFOs than the FPC has on outages. Well, a law has been passed to change that, by the way, so that may be better 10 years from now. But I also asked the FPC details about how QB29 relay went out at the Adam Beck plant, and exactly what kind of quantitative information they had in their files on the oscilloscope traces and so on concerning the statistics of the pre-outage fluctuations, and they didn't even know what I was talking about. These were the engineers that had prepared the report, and I finally explained that my objective was to make a rough probability estimate again of whether the difference between the firing threshold of that notorious relay and the mean megawattage on that line prior to fluctuation, whether that difference was several standard deviations or 500 standard deviations away from the mean square fluctuations. And I patiently explained that. The final answer was, well, we don't have any data like that. The obvious question is, well, how did you explain to the President of the United States that was a random line fluctuation? See, well, these problems are, I'm afraid, not getting very high caliber attention. And if there had not been so many of these cases, I would not be making these remarks here. But there have been just too many of these to take casually. And I shall be talking tomorrow at Westinghouse Laboratories about certain aspects of how transformers and other things work with a specific reference to this problem. And I don't expect to get any pat answers, but that I think we ought to look into because there is such a wide range. Let me just wind it up. Such a wide range, and I've only hinted it here, of electromagnetic disturbances in general. Radio, magnetometric, TV, and many other things, watches stopped, and so on, power disturbances, that you do not find it utterly absurd to think that maybe occasionally system outages are caused by this. Now, again, to pull back on that button, suppose you're walking out at the Akron-Canton airport out on the strip, and there is a banana, let's say a Piper Cub, and you don't realize that the propeller is rotating. And you will walk through that propeller. Was that Piper Cub hostile to you? Well, of course not. And when you walk down the street and you kick an anthill and it's curtains for 50 ants, were you hostile to them? No, not necessarily.